Hello, my name is Douglas Bloch. I'm an author and mental health educator. Welcome to your Depression Recovery channel, where each week we talk about practical tools and coping strategies for healing from depression and anxiety. This week is episode 8 of the serialization of my book, When Going Through Hell Don't Stop. And you'll be hearing part 1 of chapter 4, called How I Cope with Suicidal Thoughts and Feelings, which describes how I basically dealt with my ongoing urges to end my life and how I tried to resist them.
Chapter 4. How I Coped with Suicidal Thoughts and Feelings. The pain of depression is quite unimaginable to those who have not suffered it, and it kills in many instances because its anguish can no longer be borne. The prevention of many suicides will continue to be hindered until there is a general awareness of the nature of this pain. William Styron. I am the wound and the knife, victim and hangman alike. Charles Baudelaire. Philosopher Albert Camus once wrote that the only real philosophical question to ask is whether or not to kill yourself. To a person suffering from depression, however, the question of suicide is not academic. Death is sought because suffering is so acute, so agonizing, so intolerable that there comes a time, depending on the individual's tolerance for pain and the available support, that ceasing to suffer becomes the most important thing. This aggregate pain model of suicide is supported by the DSM-4 in its diagnostic section on major depression. The most serious consequence of a major depressive disorder is attempted or completed suicide. Motivations for suicide may include a desire to give up in the face of perceived insurmountable obstacles, or an intense wish to end an excruciatingly painful emotional state that is perceived by the person to be without end. Emphasis added. This is the key. It is the loss of hope, even more than the pain itself, that makes one desire to escape it. When pain is coupled with the belief that the pain will never end, then life no longer feels worth living. People in life or death survival conditions, such as being lost in the wilderness or being held prisoner of war, will dream and plan for the future in order to make their present conditions tolerable. The critically ill heart patient expresses his faith in his upcoming surgery by making a date to play golf 6 weeks after the operation. The imprisoned soldier dreams of being reunited with his wife and family. But the depressed person sees no viable future. There is nothing to look forward to, no dreams to fulfill, only the never-ending agony of the eternal present. In this context, I saw suicide not as an act of self-destruction, but as an act of self-love. To be or not to be. To remain as I am is impossible. I must either die or be better, it appears to me. Abraham Lincoln. I first began to experience suicidal feelings. The clinical term is suicidal ideation. In November 1996, shortly after I began the day treatment program. As my pain intensified, I became overwhelmed with the thought of eternal suffering. I remembered Nietzsche's words. The thought of suicide is a great consolation. By means of it, one gets through many a bad night. Realizing that I could always end my life when the agony became intolerable granted me a sense of peace and relief. This was by no means the first time I'd contemplated suicide. During my 2 previous depressive episodes, I had made 2 half-serious attempts. The first time, swallowing some tranquilizers with a bottle of beer, and the other, taking a handful of Valium before driving on the Long Island Expressway. It remains one of the more unexplained miracles in my life that I returned home safely. Moreover, I had been close to at least half a dozen people who had committed suicide, the most recent of whom was the psychotherapist I had seen prior to Pat. In a sense, the suicidal demon had pursued me my whole life. Like the legend of St. George, I was locked in mortal combat with a deadly dragon, and he was winning. I knew I was serious about killing myself when I drew up a will, named my brother the executor, and sent copies to him and a good friend. I wanted to put my financial house in order before I died. Having taken care of my remaining fiscal responsibilities, I spent countless hours deliberating on the most efficient way to terminate my existence. My first choice was to use a gun, because it seemed so quick and final. Then I remembered a crisis counselor telling me about a man who suffered irreparable brain damage when he shot himself in the head. I wouldn't try it, the counselor warned. You might end up a vegetable. My next plan was to jump off a building. But after picturing myself walking to the ledge and looking down, I remembered that I was afraid of heights. Also, a friend at day treatment had asked me an unsettling question. What if, halfway to the ground, you change your mind? Finally, I resolved to take an overdose of the antidepressants and tranquilizers that I had saved up over the past few months. This also frightened me, since I didn't really want to die, and was concerned about the people I would leave behind. I knew that if I killed myself, my friends and family would not only be grief-stricken, but angry and guilty as well. Why should I drag all of these people into my nightmare? I thought. My concerns about the impact of my death on others were shared by a fellow patient at day treatment. Don't do it, Dennis cried emphatically when I told him of my plans. Why not? My brother offed himself 25 years ago, and I still haven't forgiven the bastard. Don't make your friends and relatives go through what I did. All right, I replied. I'll try to be more considerate. Later that day, I reported this conversation to Pat. It seems like your friend has developed an ethical injunction against suicide. Do you have any similar moral beliefs? No, I replied. I don't believe it's a sin to commit suicide. I can't see why a loving and merciful God would punish someone for wanting to end his suffering. I am sorry to hear you say that, Pat responded solemnly. Why? Studies have shown that people who lack a moral or religious belief that suicide is wrong are more likely to act on the impulse. Pat's analysis was true. Without a clear moral reason not to kill myself, my resolve to avoid suicide was only as good as the kind of day I was having. When graced with 5 or 6 hours without symptoms, I would think, maybe I'm in remission, and hope for the best. Too often, however, the respite would give way to a downturn in mood, which brought with it the voice of doom. Madness or suicide, it's yours to decide. My choices seemed clear. Either spend the rest of my life in hell, I believed I would live out my days in a state mental hospital, or put an end to the pain. Both outcomes were unacceptable, but I could not imagine a third alternative. In my anguish, I cried out, God, show me another way, or at least give me some hope that another way is possible. Meetings with angels. For we are saved by hope. But a hope that is not seen is not hope. For why would a man hope for that which he sees? But if we hope for what we see not, then do we with patience wait for it. Romans 8:24-25. When Paul the Apostle wrote, "We are saved by hope," he was not speaking in platitudes. Research has shown that the risk of suicide is correlated more with hopelessness than with the intensity of the depression. It seems that we can endure all sorts of pain and suffering if we are even remotely optimistic that things will get better, or that there is meaning to our suffering. Conversely, people with lesser degrees of depressive pain can become suicidal if they lose hope for a better future. Hopelessness, not sadness, is the antecedent to suicide. If a way out of hopelessness did exist, I knew that I could not find it alone. Since my mind was trapped inside an either-or thought loop, as depicted by the rhyme, "Madness or suicide, it's yours to decide." It would take another person to lead me out of my mental prison. The first person I turned to for help was the Reverend Mary Mannon Morrissey, the spiritual director of the Living Enrichment Center. Having known me from the early days of LEC, Mary took a special interest in my case. When you start to think that all is hopeless and that there is no solution except suicide, she said, remind yourself that you are under the influence of a drug called depression. This chemical imbalance is distorting your view of reality. Thus, you should not consider your feelings of hopelessness to reflect the truth of your situation. How do I prevent myself from giving in to the despair? I asked. Try to think of your depression as a bridge instead of an abyss, a transition period instead of an endpoint. There is a universal law of polarity, which says that all states of consciousness eventually turn into their opposites, i.e., pleasure becomes pain and pain becomes pleasure. Likewise, your suffering will one day turn into joy. That's impossible, I replied. To me, depression is a bottomless black hole from which there is no escape. Then you will need to have soul strength or spiritual endurance to stay in the pain until it repatterns and transmutes, Mary replied. There is a higher power that is more powerful than any condition, including this depression. Maybe you had this breakdown so you would be forced to turn to God above anything else. Do you have any ideas on how I could do that? I know that you are a student of the Old and New Testaments, Mary replied. Throughout the Bible, especially in the book of Psalms, we hear about God's promises of deliverance. I suggest you read through the Psalms and write down the verses that give you comfort or hope. You might even want to post them in your home where you'll be sure to see them on a regular basis. Mary's faith in my recovery was comforting and reassuring and gave me something to hang on to. In the days that followed, I took her suggestion to heart. I located a number of Psalms, as well as inspirational quotations from my book, I Am With You Always, and placed them in strategic locations in my office, bedroom, and the bathroom.
This is Douglas Bloch. I hope you enjoyed listening to this part of my book. If you did so, please give the video a like. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments section, or you can email me, douglasbloch@gmail.com. If you'd like to subscribe to this channel, just click on my photo in the closing credits. You'll be taken to my subscribe page, where you can click on the subscribe button, and if you click on the bell up to the right or next to it, you'll be notified every time I make a new video or do a live chat. And until we meet again, I wish you the best in your mental health recovery. Thank you.